Share with me.
While it's doing that, let me introduce you again because we
That's
didn't get it in the recording. So Amy Barkley is speaking first. Amy Barkley is a regional agriculture specialist for Southwestern New York who has worked with poultry in a professional capacity for over 10 years. She is currently serving as a subject matter expert on highly pathogenic avian influenza as part of the New York Extension Disaster Education Network's Disaster All Hazard Response Team. Thank you, Amy. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm still frozen on my end. And my computer sounds like it's going to take flight. So
oh dear.
Yeah, I can't click through anything right now.
Huh. Yes, there it goes. Yay. Thank you.
I love technology. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for keeping up with that. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and reduce my speaker thumbnail if it'll let me. All right, and I will go ahead. So thank you everybody for coming tonight. As Rebecca stated, this is a really scary time. This virus, as we'll see in the next few slides, started to circulate in the wild bird populations, and then it just jumped into domestic birds really quick and really fast. And I think based on the trajectory of these types of viruses and what we've seen in previous outbreaks, this is going to travel fast. And so we need to take all the precautions necessary to make sure that our feathered friends stay happy and healthy throughout this difficult time. I want to share that there are two other Cornell Cooperative Extension educators joining us tonight. Christian Maltsotsky is the Agricultural Program Leader with CCE Ulster, and Steph Herbstritt is the Natural Resources Educator with CCE Ulster. They will help during the Q&A session to field some questions. Well, both of them, the one immediately following my presentation and then the one following the end of the session. All right, so the biggest takeaway that I want you to go home with is that we need to defend our flocks. Like I said, this disease is on the rise. We're only going to see more of it. And so we need to do what we can to keep our birds protected. All right, so I'm going to start with what this disease is and what we've seen in the past years to help us understand what we might expect if we happen across it in our day-to-day here. So highly pathogenic avian influenza, also known as HPAI, I'll use that abbreviation a little bit throughout the presentation, is highly contagious, and it's a virus of poultry. It is very, very deadly in poultry. We have seen some flocks contract it, and then within 24 hours, the entire flock has passed away. We've also seen in some flocks contract it, the whole flock will pass, but it might be over the course of a week. Some exhibit very severe symptoms, some exhibit very mild symptoms. But waterfowl are the exception here. Waterfowl will catch the virus, but they might not show symptoms. They'll just walk around and you won't know much is going on. Though with this, the folks who are on this call, I think you're pretty attuned to your ducks and your geese. So you might notice something's off, in which case we'll talk about reporting that in a minute. This disease is non-discriminatory. It affects nearly all strains of domestic poultry. So not only chickens and ducks and turkeys, but it also affects ratites. So our ostriches and emus, it affects game birds like peafowl and quail and pheasants and guinea fowl. So that's something to consider. The way that this virus starts is it's in the wild bird population here in the United States. And it stays as a low pathogenic strain for most of the time. It just jumps from bird to bird, not causing much disease. Sometimes it'll jump into a domestic flock, not cause much disease or problem. But sometimes it'll mutate into a highly pathogenic strain, which is what we see here. And once it does that, it becomes this highly contagious, highly infectious organism that just, it wreaks havoc when it jumps into domestic birds. So I think I kind of answered my own question as why it's so important to contain and eliminate it. But I want to reinforce that by sharing what happened in 2014, 2015 with this exact same strain. So what we saw were 200 cases in backyard flocks, domestic flocks, and wild birds. And we didn't see it in the Northeast last time it came. We saw it mostly in the Midwest and in the West. The numbers here are really scary, with 500 million birds that either died or were euthanized from having the virus on 200 farms and backyards in nearly 15 states. This was identified as the nation's largest animal health emergency at the time and still is identified that way. And through the efforts through the US government to help through reimbursements to flock owners for their birds and monies to help clean up after the virus, it costs the government nearly $1 billion. So I want to compare that to our current outbreak statistics. So here's where this thing started. This started to move from wild birds into domestic birds in Canada in early January. Now, Canada is obviously along the whole perimeter of the United States, but what I want you to focus on is this Atlantic flyway area. So this is areas where wild birds migrate up and down the coast. So each of these segments essentially represents each of the 4 flyways in the United States, and this is where the virus was found. So we saw the first movement then into domestic poultry on February 8th. So that was after the first wild bird positive was detected in North Carolina or South Carolina on January 13th. And then it very, very rapidly expanded into the wild bird population. As of this evening, when I looked up the data from the United States Animal Health Inspection Service website, we have 297 wild bird positives, most of those being waterfowl and some of them being raptors. 9 backyard flocks have been affected, 8 commercial flocks have been affected, and we've seen it in over 15 states now. So state-wise, we're really comparative to what we saw over a 2-year outbreak last time. So it's definitely a reason to be concerned. So as of tonight, we look at the cases in New York State, and on 2/18, we saw that a backyard flock in Suffolk County was affected. And this was our first tip-off that something was happening in New York State. And very rapidly, within a week, we saw that there were 2 backyard flocks, one in Ulster and one in Dutchess County, that were affected. One was pheasants and one was mixed poultry. And so we are currently working with putting out education and making sure that folks are aware, especially in those areas, of what's going on here in New York State. The reason why most of the outbreaks, well, all the outbreaks are happening in this area is likely because it is correlated with the wild waterfowl migration. So that's just something to consider. If you live near a waterway or a pond or a stream or somewhere where wild birds frequent, especially wild waterfowl, that's probably going to be a higher risk than if you live away from those areas. I want to move into classical signs, so what this disease looks like. And there are a couple of different categories I've broken these clinical signs into. But the one major sign, the hallmark of this disease, is you will have birds pass away and you won't know why. They wouldn't have appeared sick. They wouldn't have appeared unhealthy. They probably ate dinner the night before. They were fine, right? And there's no apparent reason. This, coupled with the fact that if you have multiple birds are affected, is usually a dead giveaway that you have highly pathogenic avian influenza in your flock. So please keep that in mind. These other symptoms are less common. They will occur in some flocks, and I just want to read them off to you. So reduced energy, appetite, apathy to live, reduced egg production if you have birds that are producing eggs, shell quality might decrease, so you might get really rough or bumpy or ruffled shells, misshapen eggs. The head, eyelids, comb, wattles, and kneecaps or shanks of chickens can swell up, and they might become purple and discolored. This is because the bird can't breathe effectively and it makes the skin turn purple. So I want to jump into respiratory symptoms now. In addition to those, we see things like difficulty breathing, runny noses, and sneezing. So kind of like a chicken cold. And then sometimes these symptoms appear as neurological, and these are some of the most difficult ones to see. So sometimes the birds will have twisted heads or necks. They might not be able to walk properly in a straight line and stumble and fall. They may have tremors, or they may circle. They may just walk in circles, or they might just lay down and become completely stiff. And these, like I said, they're just very hard to see, but another sign that this disease might be in your flock. So what species are affected? We talked about this a little earlier on. Waterfowl are carriers and may not show signs, but the other species, the chickens, turkeys, game birds, and rat tights, are affected and show dramatic symptoms. All right, so we know that this disease is here and we want to prevent it. And so we might think, okay, if it gets into my flock, maybe there's an antibiotic or treatment that can help, an antiviral maybe. And unfortunately, there's not. It's so rapidly acting that the reality is before treatment can become effective, the bird will likely pass away. And even if that bird was to live long enough, there isn't a cure for it. There is also no vaccine available in the United States for poultry. And there is work to try to get a vaccine, but right now there just isn't one. So we can't protect our birds in any method other than biosecurity, which are measures that we can implement to keep our birds away from wild birds and our birds away from other domestic birds. This separation is going to be our best chance to keep this out of our family. Biosecurity is a big word, and you've probably heard about it quite a bit, but what does it look like? So in the simplest terms, like I said, is keeping the wild and domestic birds away from your birds. So here's a couple ways that you can do this. You can take a coop that your birds are in and make sure that wild birds can't enter it, whether that be through a doorway, through a window, through a pop hole. If those birds have access to a run, making sure that run is covered so that birds can't poop into it. Maybe putting your feed inside of your chicken coop rather than putting it outside to keep the wild birds out of your chicken feed, because sometimes that's an attractive. Wild birds will see it and fly down and eat. So putting it away from the line sight of wild birds is going to be helpful. Like I mentioned earlier, areas with ponds, streams, and rivers are going to be higher risk than areas that aren't. If you have waterfowl that like to hang out in your pond, unfortunately, the best thing to keep them safe is to pull them inside and make sure they can't access those areas, especially if those are areas where you might see wild mallards or Canadian geese or other wild bird species. And my general rule of thumb is to keep birds indoors until the threat is reasonably reduced. And we'll talk about when that happens a little further into the presentation. So I'm going to talk through 3 methods of biosecurity in a little bit more detail so that you can have the tools that you need to implement these measures at home. So the first thing that we can do is limit visitors into the poultry house and limit visits to other poultry. Ideally, you want this to be 100%, especially during this heightened time, especially when we're being really precautious right now when the outbreak can be most severe. So if you must enter an area where other birds are, just say you have birds at home, you can wear clean clothes and shoes in, and then when you leave that property, either leave those clothes there or take them home, throw them in the washer on a hot cycle, make sure they're really clean, put them in the dryer and dry it, and that action will kill the virus. If you need to transfer footwear back and forth, I would go ahead and scrub that, or like I said, leave it there. I have a picture of my farm boots here. So we have, I was actually in the orchard with these, and you can see they're pretty dirty. I would not wear these into my poultry coop, but I wanted to show the picture of the treads of these shoes because sometimes we wash the outsides of our boots, but don't look at the treads. And the treads get really packed with dirt and dust and maybe feather dust and poop. And this can very easily transmit disease to and from different poultry areas because this disease spreads via feces or through the air. So respiratory droplets or poop. So we want to make sure that if we have shoes with really nebby treads like this, that we clean them really well if we're wearing them between multiple groups of birds. So another thing to do is, I know that some of you are bringing in new entries into your flock. It's really important to maintain quarantines for these birds. Usually 4 weeks is enough time to see if a new entry is going to have any disease symptoms of any kind before you put them together with your flock that you know the health status of. And when you're quarantining, sometimes poultry can share fences. I would recommend not doing that. So don't do what's in this picture here, just because this disease can spread by respiratory droplets. So if they touch beaks through the fence, they might be able to pass disease back and forth. As a general rule of thumb, we want to take care of new arrivals last, the youngest and healthiest first. And if you have birds indoors and outdoors, take care of your indoor birds first because they're going to be most safe and most protected. And then your outdoor birds last because they have the highest chance of having something. Okay, we're going to move into the part where you think you might have this disease on your farm, on your homestead, on your sanctuary, in your flock. And what do you do? And what we recommend and what we'd really like you to do is to report it. This helps us stop the spread of the disease. So you can report to your local Cornell Cooperative Extension office, and there's an office in every county in New York State, which is shown here on this map. Or you can report it to the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, and their phone number is below. It's your decision who you report to. All of the things that I'm going to discuss next are going to be the same process, regardless of who you report it to. So you think you might have HPAI on your property, and you report it, and what that person does next is has you or helps you fill out a backyard poultry census form. So this contains your contact information, the type and number of poultry you have on your property, and any symptoms that you see. One of the concerns that's been brought up to us is that we're here to take this information to share it with the township or the zoning board, and that's not true. This information stays confidential and is only shared between Cooperative Extension and Ag and Markets. That's it. And then once this pandemic is over, we take that information and it goes away. So we just don't share it. If you think you have a positive case on your farm, it's really, really important not to move birds or have anyone come in contact with your birds except for those who take care of them as essential personnel. This is because we don't want to potentially take a bird that might be infected and put it in a new flock where it can infect other individuals. Okay, so what happens next? A veterinarian with Ag and Markets is going to come out to your property and test your poultry. And they will take a swab, just a Q-tip, and swab either the mouth or the cloaca, the vent of your bird, or take a blood test. It depends on what species they are and what the lab needs to process it. And you will have results in 24 hours as to whether you're positive or negative. So this gets into the hard stuff. What happens if I have a positive test result? Okay, so you will work with the veterinarian who is on your case to humanely euthanize all of the poultry on your premise. That is birds both indoors and outdoors, and birds that are both clinically showing symptoms and those that aren't showing symptoms. Unfortunately, that's how it goes. And there's no way we can work around that. The good news, the little bright spot in all of this, is that you and your veterinarian can work together and have a conversation about the method of euthanasia you prefer. And I can't give any guarantees about how the euthanasia is done or who does the euthanasia. This is all case by case and something that you have to discuss with your veterinarian. All right, so I went through all of that hard stuff and I had to put my babies down, and how do I know that I've done the right thing and that the virus is gone? So following all of that process I just discussed, all the poultry living quarters in the property will be tested by environmental swabbing to make sure that the virus has been eliminated. And once we have that confirmation, we can say, okay, the case is closed on your property. So if you want to get birds again, when can you safely bring them onto your property? There are two different scenarios. So the first scenario is that you have indoor living quarters that can be easily cleaned and sanitized. And if that's the case, it'll take about a month from the time the positive is found and a negative environmental test result is obtained to be able to safely move birds back onto your property. If you have a living arrangement that is both indoors and outdoors, where birds can move freely inside and outside, or if your birds live only outside, maybe in a shelter with outdoor access, you will need at least 120 days from the day the positive is found and a negative test result to be able to put birds back on your property. So what if your neighbor has a positive test? What happens? So the red chicken in the middle is your positive neighbor, and it's called positive premise. And what happens is that once that positive premise is found, there's two zones that are going to go up, a control zone and a buffer zone. And if you want more information about this, because I'm not going to go into really deep detail on this, you can find more information at the web link below on the IFAS website. But in very simple terms, if you're in the control zone, your birds are subject to be tested. And usually in general terms, this is going to be if you are in the control zone and you report that your birds are sick, your birds will be tested. The other way that your birds can be tested is if your property is linked to a positive premise. So just say you and your neighbor are both rescue organizations and you're sharing equipment back and forth, or maybe you have a bird that's better in somebody's care than somebody else's, so you move birds back and forth. In that case, those premises are linked, and so both properties will be tested if one becomes positive. And the next one is if your property is within an infected zone. So an example I can think of here is if you are in, or if you're living in a house on a property with poultry and you have a pet duck in your house and the premise that you're living on tests positive, your property is within that infected zone and your duck will have to be tested as well. So what if you're in the buffer zone? If you're part of the buffer zone, you may end up being contacted by Ag and Markets or Cornell Cooperative Extension to be part of the backyard poultry census. And the reason that we do this is just in case that positive premise has another outbreak nearby, another outbreak, another outbreak, another outbreak. We want to make sure that you're contacted and that you're staying on the up and up in regards to what's going on around you. If you're in this buffer zone, you will also receive educational materials from the USDA and/or Cooperative Extension. So the information that I'm sharing with you tonight. And testing will occur, again, if you report sick or dead birds. All right, so I guess I should have gone back in the biosecurity section, but we talk about keeping our birds safe and in enclosures where wild birds can access and away from water. So when can we go back to normal? When's it going to be safe again? Well, it's not going to be for a little while. The wild bird migration is just starting. I just saw geese flying overhead yesterday. And this migration is going to continue through the end of April. And until then, the threat's pretty high. Additionally, this virus is a virus of cold weather, interestingly enough. So if an infected bird deposits feces outside, it's going to stay, the virus can stay active in that in the cold and snow for up to 120 days. So once we start moving into the warmer months where the snow melts, you've got brown grass, so the sun is heating up that environment, causing solar radiation, then that virus is going to die quicker. And so once we start moving into the summer months, the risk is going to go down to where you'll probably be able to let your birds out again. But that said, we also want to pair that with a decreased number of cases in both wild birds and domestic birds. So even if it's warmer and you check the IFAS website and it says that we've had a recent outbreak, it's probably not a good idea to let your birds out. So it's a combination of these two factors that'll make the decision as to whether or not it's safe to let your birds out again. If you want to stay up to date with the current outbreak, you can sign up for updates from Cornell Eden. This is the disaster response network that Rebecca had shared earlier. And you can check out their Facebook page where they regularly update information. There's a lot of disaster information on here, so wind damage and excess snow and flooding and that sort of thing. But right now we're focused on avian influenza. So if you go ahead and follow them, you'll get information. And you can also look at their webpage at eden.cce.cornell.edu for information as well. And if you haven't already signed up to receive updates from your local Cornell Cooperative Extension office, you can go ahead and do that. And they will also send information relevant to the outbreak. And I want to end with, this is hard. This is really, really hard. And it's really, really scary. But if we bond together and if we work to protect our birds, we'll get through this. We will come out the other side. We are protecting the lives of our birds. We're protecting the lives of other birds. We're being good neighbors, and we're helping to limit the continuation of this outbreak. So this is some of my birds. They're very happily dust bathing. So for more information, contact your local extension office. And I want to thank you for having the opportunity to talk to you tonight. And we'll entertain any questions along with the other two agents that we have on tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amy. Really appreciate, all the information you shared. And I guess we'll open it up to questions now. There are some that have come through the chat. So I don't know if Helena, you've found some good ones. We're going to keep everyone muted. I'm sorry about that, but we're new at running these meetings and we wanted to keep it from getting too chaotic. And it's a large group. But we are going to continue these and we're going to continue these conversations. If your question doesn't get answered today, I can guarantee you we'll follow through on them. We'll get answers, we'll post them, and we'll do more of these forums. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Helena to pick a question from the chat.
Sure. Excuse me. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
I'm coming through. Great. So I apologize if I get any names wrong, but the first question came from Edita Bernkrant. My organization and others have been trying to pass New York state legislation related to the public health risks of the over 70 live animal slaughter markets operating in New York City. The vast majority of them sell species of birds. I and others have been documenting the shocking conditions in these places for years, and especially during the pandemic. Now with avian flu here in New York, I am even more concerned, and I'm curious to hear from Amy or others about what you think the possible dangers of these over 70 slaughter markets are, operating in densely populated neighborhoods with almost no oversight and often unsanitary, uncrowded condition. I think she means overcrowded condition for the birds, many of whom are sick. Many of the markets have blood, feces, and body parts contaminating the public streets around the markets. And I believe her organization is NYFAS.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, when you think about the apparent risk, obviously it's a high risk because we're bringing a lot of birds from different places and moving them together. We don't necessarily know the health status of those birds. We do know that birds coming in have to be tested by veterinarians before coming into the state. And that's all I can really comment on about the live bird markets. I'm not intimately familiar enough with them. You can talk to ag and markets and they can provide more information. In terms of human disease risk, currently there is a risk to humans, but this is in very, very specific situations in other countries. We haven't seen any transfer of virus to humans in this outbreak or the past outbreak in the United States. So disease risk is there, obviously, but it is very, very low to insignificant.
Okay, so the next question, Jessica Hope, I saw this come in from another person on Facebook. I think there's similar questions. People asking if they can test their birds. Jessica Hope's question specifically is, are vets not testing live birds for this out? I think she means through the state. We would like to test all new birds we rescue right off the bat, but have not been able to.
Okay, so yeah, my recommendation would be to contact your ag and markets veterinarian and set up an appointment for testing. There is regular testing under the National Poultry Improvement Program for both avian influenza and for salmonella, typhus, I can't remember if it's typhus Miriam or synoviae. But anyway, there is a program that does testing. And so I would continue conversations with your ag and markets veterinarian because each of those handles those differently.
I want to say that I did read somewhere that all testing was free because they're trying to encourage people to get birds tested. So I think that's a relief for a lot of rescues. But then it brings other fears, the testing, because we're going to have to take the information you've provided, but in a rescue context, the challenges are so different. So more on that later, but yeah, it is free from what I heard.
It is indeed free. So you've read right. Okay. And what I would do if you can't get birds tested is quarantine them, because if they have the virus, you'll know, unless they're waterfowl because they hide it. But yeah, that's, if you can't get them tested, that's going to be the best way to protect your flock right now.
Okay, so Karen and Greg both asked about animal, different birds rather than chickens. So Karen asks about wild infected raptors, if there's more information about them. And then Greg asks if the mortality rate is high in wild turkeys as well. They live in an area with, excuse me, a large number of them.
Yeah, so I can't speak to wild turkeys because I haven't seen them pop up on the IFAS website. So they're not regularly tested through the testing program, but if they're found dead and it looks suspicious, they'll be tested. So if you go out and you see multiple dead turkeys, you know, something's probably up, and I would go ahead and call ag and markets to have those birds tested. In regards to the outbreak that we are currently in, of those 297 cases, 295 of those are waterfowl of varying species. 2 of those are raptors. The thought is that the raptors are becoming infected by eating dead infected waterfowl, and those birds are typically able to clear that virus on their own. So they can do that on their own.
Okay, so next are questions about caretaking. So ISA asks if there is an ideal minimum number of caretakers per flock that would slow or show a significant difference in infection. You know, assuming they follow proper biosecurity measures, if there's a certain number of people that need to be taking care of that.
Sure. My recommendation would be the lowest number of people that would be taking care of those birds effectively. So if bird welfare is going to suffer because you took away a person off staff, don't do that. Just have people follow the biosecurity protocols, and there can be additional protocols implemented. So one of the things I didn't read off the slide that I put on the slide is if you're working with birds, maybe the organization that you're working for can provide the employees with on-premise coveralls and boots and maybe a hairnet, maybe a mask, just to aid in that biosecurity, so that once those folks take care of the birds, they can strip out of the coveralls, leave them, go home, and then the risk of them bringing something in is even lower. So there's definitely methods that you can employ to help stop the spread and still have the number of people you need to take care of your birds properly.
I'm going to jump in now if it's okay. Sorry to interrupt again.
Yeah.
We'd only planned, and I'm sorry, it's a little weird, but we planned only a 5-minute Q&A for this bit. One reason for this is because Tara is going to now speak. I'm going to introduce Tara Hess. There's some interesting overlap and different perspectives coming from the compassionate source that is the wonderful Open Sanctuary Project that I think the sanctuaries need to hear the information through. And then for all in attendance, I think we're going to take all of what we just learned from Amy, what we learned from Tara, the sanctuary participants are going to talk. And then I just think more challenges and different ways of facing these biosecurity issues are going to arise. So with that, I'm going to introduce Tara Hess. I'm going to read the introduction here. And thank you so much again, Amy. We'll return to you. I hope you can hang out. Tara Hess, with a background in farmed animal care, rescue, and shelter management, Tara joined the Open Sanctuary Project as senior advisor in 2019. She hopes to use her hands-on experience as a caregiver and her experience as a frequent presenter at Farm Sanctuary's Farm Animal Care Conference, which is wonderful, to help create resources that are accessible and reflect the many nuances of sanctuary work. She shares her home with cat Juju, house rooster Cantaloupe, who I'm thinking of, so sweet, and 2 humans. So without further ado, we'll unmute Tara Hess. Thank you.
Sorry. Now I'm muted
Sorry,
again.
Tara.
Sorry, no, that was my fault. I was unmuted and then I wanted water and I muted and then I couldn't unmute again. So I apologize.
Yeah, sorry, I'm keeping everybody muted just to be safe.
No, I love it. It makes sense. So thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here to speak. But of course, I wish that this situation, the topic was different. before I begin, I mean, some people may already know this, especially because it would have been in my bio if I was, but I'm not a vet. I'm not an infectious disease expert. And so I just want to give some context in case there are folks out there that are wondering like why the heck I'm here. So the Open Sanctuary Project creates resources for sanctuaries and individuals who care for farmed animals as companions rather than commodities. And sometimes that means covering a topic that isn't really addressed somewhere else. So something like caring for a Cornish cross as a companion. And other times it means covering a topic that there's information everywhere, but we'll cover it from that non-exploitative perspective and really focusing on the things that apply to sanctuaries, because some of the stuff just doesn't apply. So my role today is to reinforce what Amy shared and then like offer a sanctuary perspective when I can. I will say I wasn't totally sure what would already be covered. So I probably have like a 40-minute presentation that I was like, well, I'll skip this and I'll skip this. So I should have set a timer. I'm going to try really hard, but someone might need to do like the little hook thing and just be like, seriously, you need to stop. I will set a timer maybe so that I can, there are some things at the end that I definitely think I should cover. So in the case of avian influenza, earlier this year, we released a resource on the subject. It was before there were confirmed cases in wild birds, but it seemed like all the experts were like raising the alarm that like this year is going to be a year that something's going to happen. And so when we were working on that resource, in addition to, of course, referring to veterinary resources and agricultural texts, we were also able to connect with folks abroad who were already dealing with the HPAI outbreaks in other countries. And so we were able to gain some information through their experiences, which was really helpful. I want to point out just a couple language things because I don't know if it's all like sanctuary folks that are going to be on the call. I'm going to say sanctuary, 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 but really I mean birds who are residents at a sanctuary, birds who are companions or considered pets, and then the people who are caring for them. And when I say birds, unless I say wild birds, I mean domesticated farmed bird species like chicken, you know, everyone that Amy mentioned. And I might switch between resident and companion, but again, I'm just talking about birds that are like outside of the industry that are being cared for as companions or sanctuary residents. So with that, I think I'm ready to share my screen. Can I just do that?
Helena should have to, I think you have to do it. I don't see how I can.
Okay, let me check.
You do your magic, please.
You should be able to, Tara. Is it allowing you or?
Let's see. Let's see if I can figure this out. I'm like as untech savvy as, oh, there's, so you can see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So let me get this presentation up. Okay, so highly pathogenic avian influenza, what caregivers can do. So depending on your experience and the individuals or species that you've cared for, you may have come across, you've likely come across a situation where information that is coming from the poultry industry or even sometimes veterinary information doesn't really ring true with what you've maybe seen firsthand. So that might mean that like you read about a certain diagnosis and it says that it warrants immediate euthanasia, but you've seen that, you know, the condition can be managed. So I think like because this happens, sanctuary folks tend to have to really think critically about information that is geared towards or coming from commercial agricultural settings to figure out what applies to them and how. And so I think this goes without saying, especially after Amy's presentation, but I just want to be clear because I know that I have this in me, this sort of like, does this apply to me? Like this does. So HPAI is not a disease that only affects commercial poultry. You know, we need to just really understand that. And I think everybody on this call is here because they do, but I did just want to point that out. And I also, before I go to the next slide, I realized that my stats. They're from, I did check earlier today, but I saw that Amy had 9 backyard cases and I have 8. So clearly this has changed. But, and again, I don't want to start on a grim note, but just to really show the reality of the situation as of yesterday. According to the USDA, 8 out of the 17 confirmed premises have been backyard settings. Of these backyard cases, 2 were even listed as pet chickens. So we know that HPAI can affect companion birds if steps are not taken to prevent exposure to the virus. So let's use the tools we have to protect them. And I don't know about everybody else, but I know the end of that last presentation was a bit rough. I knew it was coming, but it was still rough. It's really hard to hear about this disease and to allow yourself to think about what will happen if someone tests positive, especially to hear that, you know, if one bird tests positive on your property, it affects every bird on your property. And then also we know that the steps we have to take to protect them, they're not impossible, but they do take time, energy, financial resources, and all those things might already be in short supply. So if you're sitting there feeling really overwhelmed, I just want us all to stop and sort of focus on like what matters and why we're doing this. And for me, it's this rooster cantaloupe who's he lives at my house. So cute picture and just a little like heartfelt, like focus on why we're doing this. Sanctuaries face unique challenges when it comes to HPAI and biosecurity. Sanctuaries typically have less separation between resident spaces and the outside world than a large scale commercial operation, and residents often have access to the outdoors. Sanctuaries are also sometimes places of refuge for wildlife, including wild birds, who we know are a concern here. So that might make contact between residents and infected wildlife more likely. And then there's the nature of rescue. Sanctuaries are taking in birds from a variety of settings, but rarely are we taking in birds who are in excellent health or have a known health history. I mean, there was the question about the live markets, like that's where some of these birds are coming from. And there's just all sorts of things going on there. So we really have to take all these things into consideration when we're thinking about how to protect the birds in our care. So some of this was already covered. I'm going to try to skip the things that I can skip so I don't have y'all on here for like 40 minutes. So we've got like wild birds might bring it onto your property, human movement might bring it onto your property, either like on the human or on a vehicle, and then new residents. So I want to talk about housing because I feel like this is important, and Amy did cover this, but you want to take steps to reduce your residents' risk of exposure to the virus. And that means absolutely preventing wild birds from entering the space. I say wild birds and wildlife because, you know, if like rodents are getting into things that are contaminated and then bringing it in. So really like keeping wildlife out, but really focusing on wild birds. So there are a few options here, and they come with different degrees of protection and different degrees of risk. I was sort of thinking with when it was like for New York and beyond, I wasn't sure how many of the beyond people would be here. So I don't know that I would recommend all of these for like folks that are in Ulster County. But I did want to just touch on them in terms of what people can do. I think you're going to have to think about the risk in your area, and then what is possible given the birds that you care for. If you care for an emu, it might be a bit different than if you care for a chicken. So option 1 is restrict residents to indoor spaces, which, you know, is the main recommendation in terms of preventing exposure. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I do just want to mention that this assumes that the indoor space cannot be accessed by, you know, wild birds and other wildlife. Rodents can sometimes be a bit of a challenge in sanctuary settings. So if you're restricting residents to the indoors, I would make sure that you're also taking steps to, you know, block any access points that someone might have. And then option 2, if you care for just a few birds, you might consider moving them into your home. For folks who aren't familiar with the concept of like having a chicken or somebody in your house, we do have a resource called Sharing Your Home with Chickens, which, as the name suggests, focuses on house chickens, but a lot of that information can be applied to similarly sized birds. Again, like emus are going to be different. And then, still taking measures to make sure you're not, tracking the virus into your home and into their area. And then option 3 and 4 are going to be the ones that I sort of focus on a bit, because I feel like the other two are a bit more self-explanatory. And on first glance, they might look sort of similar, but there's a key difference between the two. And so option 3 is you do allow your residents to have access to an outdoor space, but it's enclosed so that wild birds and other wildlife can't enter the space. And then it has a solid roof, which Amy mentioned. So again, this is going to make sure that like a passing by bird doesn't poop into the space. Option 4 is the least protective measure. And again, like, I don't know that I would really recommend this for folks I wouldn't do this if I was in Ulster County necessarily, or the other counties that have confirmed cases or near confirmed case counties. I'm losing the ability to speak. But this is, again, an enclosed outdoor area. So birds can't physically enter the space, but you're not taking that same level of protection where poop and feathers and things can't fall into the space. So if you were going to consider this option, because for some reason the other options aren't available or aren't possible, then you would want to take additional measures, I would suggest, to especially to protect food and water sources so that your birds aren't eating from a bowl of food that has been pooped in. So this is an example of option 3, and I know the pictures aren't great. I assure you this is actually an enclosed space, even if you can't tell in the picture. I'm going to show a closer up version in the next screen. So if you're going to try to provide outdoor access, if you feel like that is a safe thing to do, but you're still trying to mitigate the risk of exposure, you would add a solid roof. In this case, it's this like clear plastic roofing, which is nice because it lets light into the space, but you might also use like a heavy duty tarp or something like that. And then also cover the sides to make sure, again, that wild birds and rodents can't enter the space. And the smaller the openings you can have, so if you use like screen or mesh or netting or something, the smaller the opening, the better, because not only will that prevent birds and rodents from entering the space, but also hopefully feathers from blowing into the space. And then you're going to need to regularly monitor this, because if a tear comes, happens in the netting or something else happens, it's not going to be as protective as it once was. And I do want to mention, if you have this setup and you have heavy rains and all this water is sort of like washing into the space, that could be another potential source, from what I've read, of contamination. So this might not be an option that folks want to do. Also, like if there's heavy snow, which, hello, it's March and I'm also in New York, heavy snow could happen. So you don't want a situation that's unsafe for your residents. So those are all things to consider, like maybe this is something you would do later on when the weather's better, when it feels a bit worse to have the birds locked indoors. And I meant to start out by mentioning that the picture with the rooster, that's Noble Rooster, he's outside of the space because this picture was taken, it's not from the US, and it was taken after the AI restrictions in the area had been lifted. So I don't want to send the impression that you do all this work and then you like let them outside sometimes. So that's why he's not in there. It was just an example of this space. Here's just a closer look in case it looked like there was like a giant gap under the roof. So everything's actually covered with mesh with a small opening. So even in the fence line, it looks like 2x2 squares or something that someone could easily fit through. Those are actually covered with a much smaller sized opening. And then you also want to think about the perimeter fence where it meets the ground, make sure animals can't go underneath, watch for digging and stuff. Again, being really vigilant about paying attention to make sure that what you've created that you are hoping is going to keep everyone out actually will continue to do that. And then option 4, again, like this would not be my recommendation generally because it's the least protective. but I wanted to mention it because I do think it's better than doing nothing if for some reason those other options are not available to someone. So in this case, you're still providing this enclosed space that wild birds and rodents can't physically enter, but because you don't have that solid top, so the sides and the top are covered with like a mesh-like thing, you don't have that same protection from poop falling in. So you'll want to take additional measures to protect food and water from contamination. If you have an indoor-outdoor setting, you could keep food indoors, you could put it under a solid cover or something like that. And then cleaning is always going to be important, but if you were going with this option, I would say you have to be super vigilant about cleaning, you know, checking for anything that's coming into the space, and then cleaning and disinfecting the space and the elements of the space regularly. And again, monitoring for breaches. Okay, so enrichment, some folks may be surprised to see this in here, but I do think that for caregivers, you know, in addition to wanting to protect them, there's also this concern of like how these restrictions are going to affect their overall well-being. And so enrichment can be used to stave off boredom, but you want to be, you know, thoughtful. Oh shoot, my 15-minute timer already went off. You want to be thoughtful about how you incorporate it. So you want to think about what you're bringing into the space, you know, how likely it is that it would be a source of contamination. There's going to be a huge difference between gathering leaves outside and bringing them into a space versus bringing like a microfiber fleece blanket for simulated dust bathing or something like that. Think about how easy it will be to clean. Something that's porous is going to be harder to disinfect than something that's non-porous. And then also think about, if you're a sole caregiver, think about your like capacity to do more. And then if you're part of a team of caregivers, think about caregiver workload, because when we're overwhelmed and rushed, like we're more likely to slip up, and following strict biosecurity measures like makes everything take longer, and especially in the winter, like covering up your gear and everything takes a long time. So just quickly, like you consider those things, and then a few things you might add to the space. Maybe some elevated spaces. I was very chicken focused on this, which I realized I wasn't covering everyone. Maybe add some covered spaces by putting a carrier, a hard plastic carrier in the space that can be easily disinfected. Maybe some like alternative dust bathing supplies. Like I said, a microfiber fleece blanket. I don't know why that's hard to say. Happy lights are a favorite with house chickens. And then if all that is just like too much, like you're not going to bring anything else into the space, even just like rearranging things every so often can offer a sense, excuse me, of novelty and make things a little bit more interesting for your people. I don't have time to do everything, but I do just want to say, like, in addition to focusing on their housing, also think about the things they have contact with. So, you know, I realize straw bedding isn't what everybody uses, but you know, that was a nice visual. Whatever your bedding is, make sure that it's secure so you don't have like wild birds pooping on your bedding, and then you're using that bedding to, you know, bed down a freshly cleaned and disinfected space. So make sure it's secure. Same with your food. You don't want to be feeding out food ever, you know, that rodents are chewing into, but make sure that that is kept in a secure area. A metal can with a tight fitting lid is a really good option there. And then all the tools and supplies that you use in the space, make sure that they are disinfected before they come in. If they're leaving the space, ideally you would have designated supplies that stay in each bird area and are kept in an area where they're not going to get contaminated. Again, I'm like thinking mostly about if you just prop your rake up outside the coop and you have somebody who poops on it and then you're bringing it inside, that's going to be a potential source of exposure. A lot of this is covered elsewhere, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But again, like you want to think about the risk of humans in the space bringing it onto the property. So the fewer people you can have coming onto your property and the fewer people you can have, again, like Amy said, without affecting the welfare of your residents, the better. I do want to talk quickly about this preventing spread via clothes, shoes, and hands, just to talk about some things that sanctuaries are doing. So again, this is going to depend a bit on are you a place that has one group of birds, or are you a place that has, multiple different groups of birds? So sanctuaries might ask staff and volunteers to change their clothes and their shoes and have that set of clothes and shoes on site, again, like Amy mentioned, so it doesn't leave. And then on top of that, having protective gear like Tyvek suits that people put on before they enter one resident space, and then they take off, and then they put something else on to go to another space. And again, this is why I was saying it makes everything take so much longer depending on your setup. I apologize if I'm just like speaking so fast, but I want to make sure I get this all in.
This is really good. Just to interject, you have another, I would say 5 minutes, and this is so critical and so helpful. So.
Okay, all right, I'll try to get it in 5 minutes. So for shoes, that picture of the boots was like so perfect. So if you take that boot and you stick that boot in a foot bath and you think you've disinfected your boots, that's probably not going to be very effective. I've seen foot baths come up a lot. And I watched a presentation that IFAH put out that did talk about foot baths and the concern that like if you use it improperly, it's not going to be effective. And I think in sanctuary settings where people are walking around all over the place outside, it's really hard. You have to clean your shoes before you dip your shoes in the foot bath. So I just want to be really clear that, if you just, step into the foot bath with your muddy shoes and then step into the bird living area, that's not enough. And so shoe covers might be a little bit more feasible, or like those like heavy duty rubber boots that you can put over shoes, something like that. And then hands, I think, is covered. I did want to talk about intake, since this is sort of unique to sanctuaries again, because we have birds that are coming from all over the place. So one thing, if you have a network of foster homes, if you can do something where you can continue to rescue, but those birds never come onto your property, I would say that is the thing to do. Because even if you quarantine, my fear is you bring a bird in, you quarantine them, they test positive, they're on your property. And so if there really are no exemptions for this, treating the property as a whole, and every single bird is affected by one bird, then I worry that quarantine isn't enough in areas where the risk is high. Folks in California might still, feel comfortable doing active rescue and bringing birds on site, but we also have to make sure we're protecting our residents. So if you can have approved fosters lined up that birds can go to, and fosters who don't care for other avian species, so you're not just putting someone else's birds at risk, I think that's a way we can continue to do rescue. I know during the last outbreak, since it didn't come to New York, I was working at a sanctuary in New York where we were like thinking about it, but we weren't super worried yet. We were doing testing even within the state to bring birds in, but I don't know that that's for everyone. And I would make sure that people really understand the implications of what happens if a bird tests positive. And then there's suspending intake. It's really hard to say no. I know everybody on this call probably knows that it's really hard to say no, but you do need to think about the risk to your residents, knowing like what was presented earlier, that a positive on your property, it's going to be birds indoors, birds outdoors. It's going to be everyone is affected by this. Okay, so what else can we do? I did a lot of the cleaning is out there. I want to talk about vet appointments because I think this is another thing that's sort of unique to sanctuaries and people with companion birds. So vet care is imperative, and likely, given how long this could go on, like somebody's going to need vet care while you're in this sort of lockdown, like high alert state. And so I would suggest you talk to your vet now about how you can make appointments safer for the individuals in your care. And this is going to depend on what they can accommodate based on the practice and also like the individual vets and also the nature of the care that's needed, right? Because surgery is surgery, but like maybe there's some other options for a physical exam. So I would see, can they do house calls? You would still follow the same biosecurity protocols because they're a person coming onto your property, but maybe having them come to you versus you go to them would put you at ease and reduce the risk of exposure. I feel like this next one we're all used to sort of with the COVID restrictions, but avoid going into the waiting room and just, give a call saying you're here and wait until they're actually ready to see you. Depending on the nature of the visit, maybe they can even do it in your car. So this is going to depend on what they need to do and who the individual is. So if I had like a game hen or a guinea who was flighty, I probably wouldn't attempt to have them examined in my car for fear that they would leave. But if you have a Cornish cross who needs like blood drawn quick, maybe they can just come out to your car, draw blood, and then you leave. If you do need to go in, maybe you can go in through a different entrance and go to like a less populated area of the clinic. And then you're going to want to make sure you disinfect that crate both before and after use. So biosecurity measures are only effective when everyone follows them and knows about them. So if you're a single caregiver, obviously that's sort of done. But if you're part of a team, I would make sure that staff and volunteers understand the current risk and the mechanism for virus introduction. Because if they don't understand how the disease spreads, they might not be as likely to take certain precautions or follow certain protocols. Have a written biosecurity plan that's shared with appropriate personnel and updated as needed. Bonus points if you work with your vet on it and have them sign off on it. Thoroughly train all personnel on biosecurity protocols and procedures. Again, it's only going to be effective if they know what they're doing. Use clear signage to communicate biosecurity. I think this one is huge, especially if there's a team of people. Like you can't just assume everybody's going to remember to, grab the gloves that are over here that are out of sight, before they open the door. Have a sign on that door that says like, you need gloves and a Tyvek suit and, booties or whatever, so that people know what's going on. And then clearly communicate if and when protocols and procedures change. And I would say communicate in a variety of ways if you can, because it's so easy. There's so much going on usually on a sanctuary to miss something. So I would make sure it's all like really easy to communicate and easy to get the most up-to-date information. This is my last thing. So don't forget the importance of thorough record keeping. I'll be honest that I don't know how exactly this will factor in, but I will say that we created a chicken care course a few years ago and worked with a vet to have it reviewed. And one of the topics was notifiable diseases. And it was really just, you need to know what diseases are notifiable. You need to pay attention to outbreaks so that you can protect your residents. And the vet who was reviewing this information really stressed the point that like thorough records are important. We were not talking about HPAI, and of course we weren't talking about this outbreak because this was years ago, but we were talking about the Newcastle outbreak in California a few years ago, and the fact that not initially, but eventually exemptions were made where certain birds who otherwise would have been killed had exemptions made where they were tested, rather than just, a flat out just like killing of everyone. Again, I don't know that this would actually come up, but I would want to have everything I had to fight as hard as I could for the individuals in my care if something came up. So in addition to a written biosecurity plan, I would have cleaning logs that really document everything that you're doing in order to keep spaces clean and disinfected. I would have a list of people who have had contact with your birds and when. I would have a vehicle log. I sort of skipped through it, but I would also restrict the vehicles that come onto your property and only have the vehicles that really, really have to come onto your property. So that might be like a fuel truck or something like that. And disinfect their wheels and whatnot, but keep a log of who actually is coming onto your property. And then resident records, you should hopefully already have that really shows that you're documenting who these birds are and the health conditions they've had. And then transport logs. So if somebody's going to the vet, when they've left the property and why. And then finally, just stay informed of the current situation, making adjustments as needed. So not to cause panic, but if you're somewhere where there aren't any confirmed cases, that's not a guarantee that there aren't going to be confirmed cases in your area next week or next month. So you want to have a plan in place for if that happens. And then just as things can change for the worse, they can and will eventually change for the better. So like Amy said, you know, at a certain point, we'll come through this and we'll all be able to start loosening our the restrictions that we have in place. So we all just really need to pay attention to what the current situation is, what information is out there so that we can make the best choices for the residents that we care for. Whew, I did it.
Thank you so much, Tara. And I mean, thank you. And both you and Amy, you know, together it gives us a picture of this situation. We're running, again, we're consistently doing the 10 minutes late, so I want to move it along, but I think 10 minutes is fairly respectable. And this information is so critical. So I thank you, Tara. And I guess we're going to go right into the round table. We're not going to do a Q&A right now, everyone, so keep your questions in the chat because I really
Tara,
wanna...
can you stop your screen share?
Oh,
oh yes, I just
how do we
don't
do
know.
that?
Oh, it's a button. There it is.
There you go.
Sorry.
So this is awesome. We now have Rachel will come in a moment, and we're gonna, while it's fresh in our minds, I want to give all in attendance, and I wish there's so many people in attendance that do incredible work, and I'm thinking I wish we could have a bigger conversation with everyone. You know, just to be able to speak to the people running in sanctuaries, and Miriam, who has done the Pandemic Free World website. I think we can all agree that this is daunting, like that. What the only thing that resounds within my head, hearing all this info, and is absolutely to do it, you know, do all these protocols, but it's so distressing how the subtext is, we know that these factory farms take all the precautions, you know, they're like fortresses and there's people in hazmat gear, right? And it still gets into those places. So there's this sinking feeling as we're starting to implement wearing the booties and the disinfecting trays. And I invested in the boot things to clean your boots, and I'm getting extra pairs of boots, and we're investing in stations, and all of a sudden running a rescue, I'm going to feel like I work in a factory farm. And also the other takeaway I have is that yes, we might get to rest after this one, but I think the prevailing knowledge is we all know it will come back, and we all know there will be another one. And so we have two jobs here in this forum, is to discuss how to protect ourselves now. But I think as sanctuaries and rescues, we're on the front lines of saying this isn't humane, this isn't sustainable. And why are we choosing, like, any form of food that requires you to wear a Tyvek suit and do biosecurity, that the rest of the world thinks this is food, when it leads to this mass loss of life, risk to human, even if it's not now. We know that it's zoonotic. We know how these things mutate. I think COVID has woken up people a little bit more to zoonotic disease. So all these things are swirling in my head about, like, okay, yeah, I can do all this and I will, but I have this I guess, anger or emotions, that it is so untenable and it is so insane to expect humans to do this. And so I'm going to open that up. I think we can unmute everyone, Helena, because this is going to be like just a conversation. I didn't want to moderate too heavily. I may direct some questions out, but I'll start with, like, Rachel.
I think I've asked everybody to unmute.
You unmute yourselves, yeah,
yes,
if you want to speak.
If you don't see that, let me know, maybe in the chat.
So my question is to Rachel, how's this going to impact you? How many birds do you rescue a year?
Well, we're in Woodstock Farm. We're Woodstock Farm Sanctuary, so we're in Ulster County, and so we were feeling kind of like we were prepping last week and feeling like we were kind of ahead of the curve a little bit, and starting lockdown procedures, and then there's, you know, the case in Dutchess and the case in Ulster, and then we suddenly felt like, oh my God, we're behind. We have about 250 birds, so it's about 200 chickens. And so it's, yeah, unbelievable. And I think that not only that, I really appreciated all that you were saying, Tara, that and looking at our biosecurity protocols that we put together, like just how much work and time that takes. And we spent $4,000 in like 2 days. I'm prepping for this. So it just feels extremely overwhelming. And like, we have to just focus on what we can do. And the bottom line is trying to protect those in our care as much as possible, because the worst case scenario is for us, it's not somebody getting positive, it's having the entire sanctuary population just wiped out, because there's, due to procedures. So we're just like really focusing on protecting everyone, keeping everyone safe. But it's, if it's going to be 2 or 3 months, it's going to be really exhausting for our full caregiving staff. And I worry about the birds. And I think we're gonna have to really get creative to keep them healthy and happy. We have a lot of waterfowl, and keeping them inside. We also have to worry about their physical well-being as well, because they really need to be on water. Yeah. It's tough. I feel very overwhelmed, but also grateful. Hervé is our shelter director. He's in our med building, which is why he's wearing the mask, because that's part of the protocol. I'm really grateful that our caregiving team is taking it seriously, and we're really just trying to do our best, but it's not perfect.
Oh, nothing is. And for Hervé, and welcome, Hervé. And you have to pronounce your last name for me. I'm so sorry. I should know. I tried, but
oh, that's okay. I mean, my last name sounds Breuil, but nobody can say it, so don't.
For you and Annie, I want to direct the question to both you, Annie Motter from Catskill Animal Sanctuary. What is the emotional impact on caregivers facing this?
It's huge. We're 2 years into COVID. It's taken a toll on everyone in so many ways, emotionally, physically. And, just when you think it's starting to die down and we're kind of getting a little bit of relief, we're hit with something else that the morbidity and mortality is way higher than COVID ever was for humans. So it's tough. But we have a really amazing team. Everyone is so great at just pitching in where you need to, and we're very lucky with the team we have now. But it's definitely tough.
Hervé?
Yes, it's not easy. It's going to be very time consuming to do this. And one of the things that I want to say is that between each coop, we have, I think, 11 coops at the sanctuary. Some of them have 11 coop with different pens inside each of them. And so between each coop, we want to make sure the protocols are respected, so that if a bird gets sick in one of the coop, if one of all those birds were to die, we want to make sure it will not spread to the other coops. And so we really want to keep those protocols strict. And I think it's really hard for caregivers to have to wear a new Tyvek suit, to put it on, and the gloves and the mask before going into a coop, then taking it off, going to another coop, and doing this over and over again all day long and for so that's going to be really hard on the staff. And having clear written protocols in place is really easing everybody's mind. And I think that's really important to do. And as Tara also pointed out, the enrichment. So today, for instance, we changed all the bulbs in all the coops to have full spectrum bulbs for all the birds, because they may be inside for the next 3 months. We also make sure that we have exhaust fans everywhere, because it gets so humid in those coops. And I think that was not mentioned, but it's really important, because we are really at risk of developing fungal infections in those birds because of the humidity in those coops. So we must really have exhaust fans even during the day in winter. So it's going to be really hard on everybody to see all those birds cooped in as the nicest days are coming, and we want to open those doors and we can't. Like today, it's really sunny here in Ulster County, and they have to stay inside.
Yeah, if I may say, it's really hard to listen to all these protocols about enclosure. And I can say we're really proud of our runs and how enriched they are, and there's light and the anyone who knows these avians, these people, understands how much they want to roam and explore, and you can give them the most enriched environment. This is my experience, and they'll be okay in it. But I personally see them stress so much, especially when they've experienced freedom. You know, we don't free range without supervision, and we're a very small, tiny area, and it's enclosed. But like, just depriving them of that and their desire for that. So like, it's easy for us to talk about doing all these protocols and enriching and doing this, but I think caregivers really know the stress we're going to face every morning walking into these coops, and these birds are just screaming to get out. The hens rely so much on foraging. Like I can give them all the treats and all the feeds that I think they like, but I find that they just have this innate desires, you know, to get out and to really forage. And it's for those of us concerned with respect and dignity for these birds and giving them a quality of life that is dignified and respectful for who they are as individuals. This is a devastating situation, and we're not able to just go, oh, it's just another 4 months after they had 4 months of winter. It's really like, wow, we're all about quality of life for them. So we'll all make the best of this. I think we'll all do the enrichment, but and then there's the loss of life, even if you do everything right, you know. So I wanted to bring Miriam into the conversation. Miriam, besides running New York Farm Animal Save, Miriam Chisholm, and having done Pandemic Free World, the website, which we worked a bit together on. So we spent a lot of time at COVID studying zoonotic disease and pandemics, and came up with Pandemic Free World, which Miriam spearheaded. But then now Miriam's been helping with the care at Institute for Animal Happiness. And we've been trying to do the chute changes and stepping in and out. And the more we've tried to implement this level of biosecurity, it's become clear that our facility was not made for this level of biosecurity. Like, we always had really good quarantine for if one new bird came in, you know, we had those practices. But now the idea, and even COVID felt easier than this, because I could just tell people don't come. But I can't tell all wildlife and mice and chipmunks to stay away, and they'll keep trying to dig in. And so, you know, for us, it's devastating. It's like, do we try to build stuff completely different? We thought we were doing it at the highest level possible, heated, insulated coops when I started this. But Miriam, just describe like the shoe changing and trying, you know, what we do every morning to not step on ground or not put a tool down. So no.
Right. Yeah. The first day we went out to do it, I think we were both, our heads were spinning. We tried to talk it through first, and then we started doing it. And then all of a sudden we think, oh, wait, no, we can't do that because XYZ, that's going to touch the ground, and it can't touch the ground. It was just a whole new way of looking and thinking about everything. So, you know, like putting the booty on, well, you can't put the booty on and then walk across and then go into the coop. You have to put one booty on, put that foot in the coop, and then put the other booty on, and then you can go in the coop and walk around. And then, you know, getting the birds to go into the run, you have to go into the run with one set of booties, then you come out and just walk to the door to go into the coop. You have to put another set of booties on. And it was like, well, you're going to use like 500 booties in one day.
Yeah. I mean, it's an environmental disaster on top of that. You know, this is like, we all got through COVID and we thought, okay, the masks are going away a little bit. We're still respecting it. We need them for the more vulnerable. But here we are ordering. I mean, it makes my heart break for how broken all of this is. So you know, especially for youth sanctuaries. And then there's the impact on staff mental health. Like, I mean, Annie, you were saying you have a really good team, but it's a hard job doing animal care at a large sanctuary in particular. Even a small one kills me. So I mean, I know it's hard at a large one. And this is a strain on staff. It's more of a workload. So, I mean, it's early in the process. Do you, Annie, feel sort of like you're in a groove with your protocols, or do you feel like you'll have to get a lot more done, figured out?
I think we're in a good place right now, but I think there's always more work to be done. I think the more you think about stuff, the more questions that pop up about how to deal with certain things. Like you find one solution, then like 10 more things pop up, like filling the water jugs for the day. You know, like you're dragging the hose across the barn aisle where you're picking up all the rat poop and stuff like that, and you're putting it in the jug. And so how do we fill all the jugs up and make sure that the water that gets to the birdhouses is clean? You know, problem solving, all these little things that you don't even think about, you take for granted on a daily basis. It adds like 50 more steps to your day. So I think we're getting to a good place, but I think we're never going to be 100% until we're a little bit further along. Just as things pop up, you solve the problems.
For everyone, let's talk some of the vegan ethics that could prevent these kind of. So, one thing I want to say is it occurred to me, we refer to COVID-19 as a pandemic because it affected humans, but it seems kind of, and maybe I'd love to know if you agree with me. I feel like avian influenza is another pandemic because of all the loss of bird lives. Why we only call something a pandemic because that disease affects humans. It seems rather speciesist and unfair. We have lost, and if we could classify that and start to link it to the human experience, okay, humans experience their pandemic, but now avians experience it. Is that unfair, or am I like making a weird leap? I just think it's odd that we don't refer to this as a pandemic because so many lives have already been lost. I don't think we even know how many, you know, it was several large facilities like in Indiana. And so it's been probably already, I don't know, tens of thousands in the United States and millions in Europe. Tara, yes. Can you be unmuted? Oh, there you go. I think that.
I'm sorry.
Wait, I would love you to be, sorry. Do you know how to unmute yourself?
Apparently not.
There you go.
I don't know what's wrong. All I was going to say is that the USDA APHIS, I mean, this is a huge downer, but that website that lists, you know, you go to their main page, it'll have their announcements, and then there's like, you know, domesticated cases and wild bird cases, and you can see all those cases. It lists the numbers of birds at the facilities, and I think the place in Delaware was like 1.2 million birds. Yeah. That's one place.
And why don't we call this a pandemic? It doesn't affect humans, but why don't we care about that loss of avian lives? Why don't we, when swine flu hits and literally 1.5 million pigs are buried in Asia, which happened, you know, I think it was like a decade ago, there was a huge outbreak. Actually, we don't know if it was a huge outbreak because they didn't even test all the poor pigs. They simply buried them alive, right? In a giant trenches. And why, as a society, we are okay with a system that keeps allowing this to happen. So, you know, obviously I wanted to talk about all of us and what we're going through, but just on a larger scale, I feel like the only sane thing you can do coming out of these protocols is go, wow, you could get a vegan chicken wing now or a nugget for, why are we even doing this? Like, at what point does the USDA say this is broken? Like, it just doesn't make sense. It's just it's hard on the people, it's endangering human lives because we know this will jump around and it'll eventually mutate to something a human will get. And by the way, I have read stuff that said that people have died from this already, just not in this country, right? And that's a concern. Miriam, did you read those articles? Because Miriam does a lot of all the work for Pandemic Free World, so she's constantly combing these articles, and it just seems a little extreme that we allow this to happen, right?
Yeah, there hasn't been a huge number of people who contracted it, but there have been, and the fatality rate is like 60%. So it's pretty high. And it could totally become the next pandemic.
Yeah, it has also, I think, another version of avian influenza, because there's so many, the quote unquote Spanish flu, that was an avian influenza. Am I incorrect? That's
what I've read.
That's everything I've studied said that. So it's not like this is a new thing, like avian influenza being a threat to people. This is going to impact sanctuaries, obviously, on another level, which is so many of you, Catskill and Woodstock and some of the others in attendance, depend on visitors. And to help, first of all, educate them so they'll go out and save lives and make changes. But now this is foot traffic is going to be a real issue. Any one of you want to address that?
Yeah, we're taking that on like a case by case. Well, the good thing is we're currently not open for our tour season and won't be until May. So we're obviously not allowing anybody who's not care staff into any of the bird areas and limiting even that. But we're kind of waiting and seeing in terms of visitors for the visiting season, because we can really keep people far away from any chicken areas. But we will have to revisit that if all of a sudden there's a ton of cases in wild birds in the area or in any backyard flocks. I was thinking about what you were saying, Rebecca, about two things about just how there's so many really great bird advocates, not only on this forum, but on this call. I see like Vanessa and Jessica and Andrea and Jamie. And I think like, I think about how are we talking about this? Not definitely in the way you're speaking about, Rebecca, like how can we speak about this within an ethic and a industrial ag that has created these very vulnerable birds and then allowed pandemics, just bird flus like this to spread and pig flus like this to spread to the vulnerable animals that are created within the system. But also like, how can we speak about this happening at sanctuaries without making it seem like these birds are dirty or that they shouldn't be house chickens or that they are somehow, that we need to protect humans from bird populations when really what we're talking about is protecting our birds.
Yes.
That's something that I'm really trying to get my head around too, because what we don't want to do is further stigmatize these birds that are already so stigmatized as being.
Absolutely, but it's really hard. It's really hard because if this gets worse and the focus becomes freaking out about, the chicken industry and how is this going to affect farmers, then they create this panic where it's just a dragnet, I hate to say that, like kills everyone. So it's a really almost impossible, it's a difficult line to walk where you're like, I'm exercising the most stringent measures to protect our birds, but at the same time, I'm supposed to destigmatize this. And it's just an imposition. I feel like telling animal ag, you create this situation that it's really hard for those of us who are ethical to navigate and exist in this space. It's almost impossible.
Yeah. It is, and we all know the media images that are already coming out about it with, hazmat suits and people just, gassing and killing birds. And, that's already sort of the images that are being pulled up in the news coverage. So, yeah I think that's
and people see us wearing hazmat suits and the booties, which are what is needed to control this. Suddenly, I'm projecting that this is a hazardous area, and I do want to scream and go, actually, humanity, you're the one that's hazardous. You created this. Your way of treating animals and packing them in and treating them as products and manipulating their body, their biology, you've created this. And these birds they're all innocent. They're just trying to live and exist and have relationships and be loved just like anyone else. So these are the challenges I think we face as sanctuaries, and that's one reason why I wanted to have this conversation. For Miriam, like obviously working on pandemic-free world, you were reading about all zoonotic disease, avian flu was one of them. And obviously when you study all the outbreaks and Ebola and these things that are from the past, what's your inevitable conclusion coming out of it? Working on that site for a couple of years now. And you also, I should say, Miriam does street actions bi-weekly, going out educating the public on the fact that COVID-19 was zoonotic, but linking it and making sure they understood all zoonotic disease. So yeah, where does this all lead us? So you studied and studied, you made this site. How can we all, whether you care for chickens and poultry and different birds or not, what can we all do to change this situation, to stop?
Well, I'm definitely not an expert. I'll say that. You know, I looked at all the articles that, you know, we both looked at all the articles and tried to read everything we could about it. But really my takeaway is, if we want to prevent future pandemics, really the best thing we can do is be vegan, because the way we farm animals, the way we use animals, the way we're destroying the land, climate change, everything we're doing, we're destroying everything, and that's bringing us closer to animals, and that's creating greater risk for future pandemics. So if we were, you know, in a perfect world, we were all vegan, we wouldn't be using animals, we wouldn't farm animals, we wouldn't have to have biosecurity for our food. You know, that's really my takeaway.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's that one sentence we kept coming up on in researching for that pandemic-free world? And I was learning as I was sort of following your lead, was like that scientists say, this was repeated over and over again with COVID, we're entering an era of pandemics. We're entering an era of pandemics. The last thing I want to bring up is regarding vaccines. I communicated with Dr. Jagny at Cornell in Ithaca, and she actually said in writing that there was a vaccine, but that the USDA keeps it under lock and key. And this, I could be wrong on this, but this is her words. I can share the communication. She said there was a vaccine, but the USDA kept it on lock and key. In fact, I could screen share it now, but that it would shut down chicken exports because birds that are vaccinated and birds that have the illness would both test positive. So that because of that, they wouldn't vaccinate birds. And that to me was very stunning. And she said, this is a state reportable disease. And that was sort of how the conversation ended. And it was a conversation, I should say, a friend of mine initiated, but I had similar other conversations with her about other illnesses. And it just, I think we all can agree, what other industry has that much power over both human health and non-human health, that they have the right to withhold a vaccine because it will destroy one market, you know, when that is untenable. I mean, people have died of this disease. It does mutate when it jump. So this is really critical to be discussed. And this is way bigger than us, a little chicken rescue. Like, this is talking about ethical issues about public health. So I just want to put that out there, that from my understanding, there is a vaccine in existence, and it comes from a top avian vet at Cornell, but that is purposely being withheld. So so Hervé, like, you've been vegan for a long time. How long have you been working at Woodstock Sanctuary now?
So 10 years at Woodstock, and I've been vegan for 21 years.
So you look like you're alive. You look very healthy. You have a family, right? You're like people can be vegan, right? I mean, what is your response to all the backbreaking work you have to do every single day, right? And then someone comes to you and goes, oh, guess what? There's avian flu now. You've got to deal with this. I mean, how does that make you feel when it's so unnecessary? It's just a hardship that's so extra unnecessary on top of everything else.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And then I would defer to Miriam about the transmission of about zoonotic diseases, but I do want to talk about testing and reporting, because at sanctuaries we would be required to, if we were to test our birds, it would be reportable, and all our birds would be killed. Well, let's be clear, if I have a sick bird, I'm not going to test any birds. I don't want our birds to be killed. And we are taking the precautions here so that if I have a bird that's sick in a coop, all our other coops are going to be protected. And we are not going to kill all our birds to protect poultry farms. This is not happening.
Right.
Now, so testing is not mandatory, obviously, and it can't be. If we have a sick bird, nobody can know what they are dying of. And people do whatever they want at their sanctuaries, but I can tell you that we are not going to test anybody just to protect all our birds who are not food animals, they are pets. And we're not going to kill 249 pets who are healthy because I have one who is sick. So I'm just, I just want to throw this out there because this is what I'm taking out of this. This mandatory reporting is really to protect commercial.
Yep. Yeah. It has nothing to do with our work. It doesn't consider rescues at all. And I mean, in general, animal rescues in society, we're basically here to clean up other people's messes. You know, everybody else is behaving irresponsibly, right? And we're supposed to just take all those animals, all the roosters that people don't want because they don't lay eggs, and all the, you know, hens that no longer lay enough. It's just our job to step in and, you know, deal with people's decisions. So I think we can all agree, like, so one purpose of this forum is to start getting us together to say something has to fundamentally change, right? In a new way. This opportunity, HPAI, is a new way for us to show and educate people on the hard job that we do, and help create a unified voice that says, you know, times are changing. These these friends are not just expendable because you decide to do something irresponsible and dangerous, which animal agriculture is. And why do we have to keep screaming that? It's dangerous to the planet. It's dangerous to people. Millions of birds get killed and nobody thinks about it. And it is heartbreaking. And we can't get everyone. I can't get all my neighbors on this mountain to have biosecurity. Most of them, to be honest, haven't even read a book how to care for the birds. So I fear what's to come. I'm going to do my best, you know, but I think it's pretty devastating what may lie ahead. And even if this is controlled, it will just keep happening. And it's so we have to be a unified voice. I hope everyone agrees with me on that more and more. I think this is our opportunity. People are not educated about the ethics with which we work and how much we care. And you're right, Hervé, that's a brilliant point. It's like, I'm not killing all my birds to save the chicken industry. I don't even think of them as my birds. I'm sorry to even use that. They are them. They are individuals we care for. But for convenience purposes, I sometimes say that, but I don't think of them as mine. They're not, I don't own them. They're friends that needed help and they came here for care. So we have to start moving towards the Q&A. We're getting there. So anyone else? I mean, everybody.
I was gonna say just one thing, if that's okay. I watched this presentation that a few people recommended earlier today. It definitely has things in it that I think, don't mesh with probably the ethics of most people on this call. But it was put out by the Raptor Center about HPAI, and I think the person who presented was an epidemiologist, and I think is also the executive director of the Raptor Center. And it was really interesting. It was geared towards rehabbers and also like zoos. And I guess that was like the primary focus. But it was interesting. What came up was that, it can be really detrimental in raptors, and I guess they die really quickly. And so I would assume that they can also shed it, but it sounded like positive cases at zoos and rehabs, which I realize we're talking about different species, but they're not lumped into this like stamp out everyone thing that the USDA has going on. And so it's just like another example of it being so frustrating that there's no differentiation between a sanctuary and a farm.
Yeah.
In terms, in the way, I mean, obviously there are a million differences, but in the way we need there to be a difference, there isn't.
Yeah. But tragically, and then the irony is there is no difference. Those sweet birds need help and friendship and rescue and real compassion, and they're just treated as disposable. And this is another instance where it's really hard to get the public to take it seriously, because the reputation, these birds are just considered so disposable. So I thank you all. I want to give everybody like sort of a last chance, like this is our chance. We're talking about avian influenza. Before we go into the Q&A, we're talking about avian influenza and it impacts all of you. So if there's a takeaway, starting with Hervé, do you want to say one more thing?
Yeah, I want to say one more thing. I think as sanctuary, we should definitely unify to get an exemption. That vaccine you were talking about, we should get it because our animals are not food animals. Those broad spectrum antibiotics that are denied to us, whereas they would be really effective because our animals are considered food animals, but they will never be on somebody's plate. We should be able to get them. So we should get an exemption. Sanctuaries as in companion animals, as in pets, compared to farms. And we should be able to use those vaccines and those antibiotics to protect our animals. And we should also have exemptions if we have a disease, like I was saying, if one of the birds or one of the flocks we have is sick, that we don't have to kill everybody. If we have been taking the appropriate biosecurity measures, which I think everybody here has. And so I really hope that we get there and we all get together to ask for that exemption so that our animals are not seen as food animals anymore.
Let's do it. And I just sent you, I just sent everyone, I posted the text, and it's right there from top avian vet at Cornell. So Annie, anything, parting words to everybody about like what they can do to support the caregiving you're doing during this time, or any message CAS would like to impart?
There's so many messages that we can take away from this. I think a large part of this kind of brings up other issues when you think about how your domestic birds interact with wildlife as well. My background has been in wildlife and rehab and environmental biology, and I think about that a lot. Like, this isn't the first time that we've had issues with wild birds infecting our birds with other things. You have like mites and canker and all these other things, and it makes you really think about the best practices you can use in the long term, not just for this one instance and keeping our birds safe, but also respecting like these migration patterns that birds have used way longer than we've been developing these lands for, and trying to work with the wildlife that live with us.
Thank you so much. Rachel?
Yeah, and one thing that keeps, when we've been going over these protocols the last week or so and thinking about how we can possibly like annex human spaces on site at the sanctuary and to just give the birds more space, and like just trying to be as creative as possible so that they have more room and more enrichment and more ability to be healthy and happy during the next couple months. And the thing that I keep thinking about is how bad I feel for them and how still their experience is better than 99.9% of birds of their type in this country, and how terrible that is that even our worst is so much better than the average farming situation, and how incredibly tragic that is. So I think there's something heartbreaking, but also really great that we all really care about these birds so much, and that the idea of having them not have the autonomy that they're used to for a couple months is so heartbreaking.
Thank you. Miriam, what do you want people to know?
I guess from my perspective, you know, I work at your sanctuary, but, you know, from the pandemic-free world perspective, I'd just like to mention there's a really great documentary that I wish everybody would watch. It's called Extinction, the Facts, with Sir David Attenborough. It talks about biodiversity loss, the crisis we're in, the consequences for everyone, humans and non-humans. You know, it's threatening our food and water security, climate change. There's a greater risk of zoonotic pandemics. So please, if you have a chance, watch that. It's called Extinction, the Facts.
Thank you. I think we're going to open it up to Q&A so that the biosecurity, people have a lot of biosecurity questions, and for Tara and for Amy. And that, and I see Steph, Amy's colleague, is posting some clarifications on the vaccination, which I'd be interested in learning more about, because I was sure confused about that. So thank you, everyone. We're gonna, I guess, Helena, you want to go through questions in the
Sure.
chat?
So I'll just go backwards and start with the furthest back questions. There's a few questions about biosecurity inside of a home, and then also about neighbors. So if you have, let's say, a house chicken or a small flock that you care for, what happens if your neighbor has a flock that they don't care as much for, or, you know, is there overlap, or would they have to be tested, or could you be affected by their test results? There's also maybe similar questions about dirt and grass versus gravel. So any kind of cross-contamination issues.
So that's two different questions. Maybe we do the first one, which sounded like somebody with a small flock and the birds lived in their human home. Was that it?
So I'll read it directly. Regarding, quote, the buffer zone, would that include, let's say, a neighbor or someone a few houses away, and in that case would not be subject to testing if there was a positive case?
So I can speak to the size of the buffer zones. I pulled up the information on the website that I posted on that one slide about them. And so the buffer zone, it looks like generally they're 7 kilometers or 4.35 miles wide. And then the control area is from the epicenter 6.21 miles out from that. So 10 kilometers wide. So you're in this together. That's just unfortunately how it is.
So another question about, you know, I'm going to go to a different question because that one kind of leads into this one. There was a comment by Kathy Stevens of you guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
I forget to check if I'm unmuted. There was a comment from Kathy Stevens from Catskill Animal Sanctuary. She says, why is the recommendation to euthanize all birds on a property, even if there's only one positive case and proper biosecurity is being strictly followed? At Catskill Animal Sanctuary and other sanctuaries, we have many bird buildings that are quite spaced apart. If proper protocol is being followed at each site, why the recommendation to kill them all? And then my personal follow-up, then hearing that and the buffer zone, is everybody within that 10 kilometers then affected by these test results? If one bird were to get sick, let's say at CAS, could someone, maybe a kilometer away be affected by that result?
So the positive test result is not going to mean that people within the buffer are going to have their birds euthanized. It just means that there's increased oversight in regards to testing of those birds. And if birds are positive, indeed positive, not suspect, they're indeed positive, then you can go through some of the activities that I've outlined. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the goal isn't to wipe out birds within an X number of kilometer radius. That's not the goal. The goal is to preserve as much life as they can while doing their best to eliminate a risk.
I think that question, if I may, is arising because of the Newcastle situation in California about 2 years ago. They were just going door to door, and if you were in a radius, and I don't know why that situation is different, that disease is different. It seems like it has a high mortality rate, just like avian influenza. So I'm very grateful if that's not the case here. I actually have someone who works here extremely part-time who also works at Woodstock Sanctuary. Wonderful, wonderful person that helps out. But I had to tell them that they couldn't come right now until we sorted this out, because I was scared if someone passed or got sick at Woodstock or vice versa, how would it affect each other? So you're saying that's not the situation here.
That's not the situation, but if you are sharing employees, then it could be.
Right. Okay.
So the point really is prevention as much as possible.
Okay.
So Greg asks about, so this is not substrate in runs, but around a sanctuary or a house, do different substrates have a difference in risk? Dirt versus gravel versus grass?
Good question. I don't know the answer. I would assume that there's different holding capacities, but I haven't seen any studies that have indicated that different substrates react to holding virus differently. We do know that there's a difference between snow and no snow, but other than that, we don't know.
I think would it relate to drainage of each substrate? Would like gravel be better than soil perhaps because it drains a bit better?
Could be. Yeah, so you don't have standing water that can pass the virus around in a wet environment.
We're going to go about 10 minutes over. I hope that's okay with everyone, just because we started about 10 minutes late and there are some more questions. If people have to leave, let us know. And Helene, I was going to say you should unmute Steph Herbstritt if you can, who is piping in the chat. And it might be easier to have Steph, speak because they're an expert in this stuff as well.
Yes. Okay, should be unmuted now.
Yeah.
So just pop in whenever.
I'm unmuted. I did just want to say I'll pop in the chat at the USDA APHIS website. I was just doing some Googling while Amy was doing a great job answering that. They do have, there's one study on substrates, but like Amy said, there's nothing about like gravel versus soil, but there are some substrates that they list, like grass, metal, manure, dried feces. So I can pop that in the chat and we'll check that out.
Thank you. There was that statement, Amy, I think it was from your presentation that the area had to be clear for 120 days.
Right, right.
So so basically there is some information somewhere that it can last in the environment for 120 days or a little less than maybe 100 days.
Right. So that's where they did the testing between a cold, snowy environment and then a warmer environment to see how long it lasted in the different seasons, essentially.
But there's no study about like how long it lasts on a table surface.
There probably is information about that specific question.
Okay.
I haven't come across it. Steph, you're the Google master, so maybe you'll come across it quickly. But yeah, if we find anything like that, we can send it your way.
And Helena, I can't see all of the chat questions, so tell me if there are more, because people put a few on Facebook that are actually really important from earlier.
Yes, I think we've gotten a couple of those. There was another one that I'll just read from Helen from Facebook. If someone with a backyard flock notices a bird with respiratory issues and, as they may normally do, they administer Tylan, does this disease respond to Tylan or other antibiotics and therefore make it more difficult to identify for the average? And I know we don't use this terminology at the Institute, but for the average backyard poultry keeper.
Yeah, great question. Antibiotics don't affect viruses. They're an entirely different class of infective organism. So it wouldn't mask symptoms if you use Tylan. If you use Tylan and it was effective, it was probably a bacteria.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the house biosecurity measures. Let's see, there are, Kristen asks, I brought my feathered friends inside the house. What biosecurity measures do I need to take when entering my home?
Yeah.
And then she also just wants to generally know about biosecurity measures. And hopefully this is similar, but Vanessa asks about other pets in the home, chickens and dogs, if there's cross-contamination.
And if I may say, a number of people asked that on Facebook as well. There was a concern of like, if you have a dog that comes in and out of the house, do you have to disinfect their feet? If you have a house chicken, which many people do now, more and more. Do you think, Amy, do you know anything about that? Or?
Well, I was actually going to throw it up to Tara because you had such great information about biosecurity.
I was hoping you would know. I mean,
I can speak to it, but
I would love to hear what you think. And then if there's something that I can add, I will, but.
Yeah, so my thoughts are, if you bring a chicken inside and you are taking precautionary measures like washing your hands before you're eating after touching feces, or eggs that are deposited that might have feces on them, it's a relatively safe thing because you're not letting that bird indoors and outdoors. And the only risk that you are bringing in is whatever you bring in on your shoes. So perhaps you can take off shoes that were outside and put them in a fenced off, like a baby gated area. And then your house chicken housed up can't touch them and interact with them and potentially get something spread to them.
Right.
In terms of dogs, it's a risk, but you can monitor maybe where your pup goes outside and maybe clean feet. I'm not super familiar with how to mitigate risk with puppy dogs.
So I had similar thoughts. I wasn't sure if there would be something else that came up, but so I have like one chicken in the house. And I don't have a dog. Like that's the thing that sort of throws me off. But we are being really careful about, taking our shoes off at the door and washing our hands. I feel like this is like controversial. We're still feeding wild birds, which I know is sort of like some people are not doing that. And I like in another setting, I might not be doing that if I had coops outside and like I was walking all over the yard, but we're literally walking to the feeders and walking back. So we're being careful about, that like I cover my clothes, I wear something different, we wash our hands. We don't have a dog, we have an indoor cat, but I don't know if there's a way. I mean, if you think about what's going on at settings where birds usually have outdoor and indoor access, and now they're restricted to the indoors, you might use that same mentality in terms of like adjusting their space, right. Which again, it has impacts on like their, quality of life and what they do. But if, where the dog goes, maybe the chicken doesn't go, maybe the chicken's in a separate area, because I have no idea how you would thoroughly disinfect a dog's paws. I certainly would if I had a dog out in the yard. I wouldn't be feeding the birds out in that yard that he's running around in. Yeah. So things like that to lessen the likelihood that the dog is going to track the virus in.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to figure out our front door situation because we have the special needs chickens, the disabled birds do live in the house, and then we have the coops outside, and we have a cat. And even if we step into a certain area and take off our shoes, we notice the cat was going to lie down on that station that so it's like so frustrating. Everybody's figuring this out. One question that pertains to this that's a little more detailed is in the chicken, Vegans with Chickens Facebook page, where I get a lot of information and we all share a lot of resources. There was a discussion of two products. One was called Virkon S as a disinfectant that's effective against avian influenza. And one is called Rescue. They're both veterinary disinfectants, but apparently what some had researched in the forum, I'm just telling this as general information for people with dogs, is that Virkon S shouldn't be really used on a dog's paws. It's meant for surfaces, but it can irritate skin. So they recommended this product Rescue, and I can try to post on the Facebook page, or you can write me. I'll send you the links for both these products. But yeah, I don't know, Amy, if you have that detail, or Steph, about, do you have a list of accepted disinfectants or somewhere?
So I have a list of accepted disinfectants, but they're for premises and surfaces. They're
Okay.
not for
Or dog
skin.
paws. Yeah. Okay. So Rescue is the one, and I'll share that link tomorrow. Any other questions in the chat? Because I have one or two more here.
Yeah, there's a really great question from Greg that I saw. How about mowing your lawn and getting all those particles into the air? Could that be another potential source of spread if there was, birds flew overhead, pooped in the yard, and then you mow your lawn?
Theoretically, but by the time you're mowing your lawn, the weather's warmer. And so that virus is going to dissipate much quicker in the environment. If you have wild geese that stopped in your lawn for a quick snack and then flew off and there was poop there, I wouldn't mow immediately. I don't think the risk is significant, but it's still a risk.
Do you think it would be safer to obviously let is a key word, but if it were really dry out, the bird poop dries out more, is it less likely to transmit it if it's drier?
It is, yeah. So it sounds like we need some information on the time it takes to desiccate that virus in a warmer environment versus a cooler environment. And I think there is some variation in that. It's definitely less than 120 days, because I'm seeing a question that just popped in right now. Should we wait 120 days? Another thing you can do actually is you can get an environmental swab from wherever you want from ag and markets. And you can go ahead, swab the environment, send it in, sample it. If it's negative, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way that you can be proactive in testing your environment and making sure that there's nothing there that you're tracking indoors.
Are those by any chance free as well, or is that something you pay for?
I don't know. I will look though.
Okay.
I would think it's free because it's provided by ag and markets for a pandemic related cause.
I do want to give Amy, you and Steph, a chance to clarify the vaccine information I got from Dr. Jagney. So Steph posted some information. If there's anything contradicting that, I'd love to know it, because it was definitely concerning.
I'll let you go, Steph, since you've been researching it so well.
Oh, just while we've been on. Yeah, so I was not able to open the ENG file that you put into the chat, unfortunately.
Oh, sorry.
And I'm sorry about that. But I know through on USDA's website, they have this fact sheet, and I put a link to it in the chat. And it does echo what Amy was saying, that there's not an approved vaccine for use at this time. So it's not approved for use. And it gives you some information in that fact sheet about what the vaccine would and would not do if it were approved. So it says that the highly pathogenic avian influenza vaccines reduce sickness, clinical signs, and death, but they would not prevent birds from becoming infected with the virus or from producing and shedding virus into the environment.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the
Listen.
exact, that's the exact same thing as a Merrick's vaccine for
Yeah.
those of you who are familiar with Merrick's.
And with the Merrick's vaccine, you can actually do worse damage, I read on Open Sanctuary, and actually create a hot spot.
You can if you use a chicken-derived vaccine, because it is a live attenuated vaccine. So if a chicken vaccine is used, yes. If a turkey vaccine is used, you're in the free and clear.
Okay. Wow,
They're tricky.
This is so tricky. You're also wonderful. There's like one or two more questions. I feel like we can get them in if we do them quickly, because everybody's been so patient. Hannah Birch said, I think my question got lost. If you have time, I'm in the Western US, Utah, and I'm wondering what the projection is for the virus moving west.
We don't currently have a projection, but I will say that, so the way that we find wild bird positives is through testing dead birds and through testing birds that hunters bring in. They voluntarily bring them in for testing. And those efforts have expanded into the central flyway. And I would assume they're going to start expanding further west as we go along, because it's moving, right? We're seeing it in the Midwest. So the preventative efforts and they're going to look for the virus so that folks stay ahead of the outbreak. So if you keep checking into that IFAS website on the wild bird positives, you can see where those positives are starting to show up to see if they're coming to your state or not.
I think it also has to do, I read on the USDA site an article about it being linked to predictable migratory patterns of birds. Like they knew it was coming to New York because we were part of this avian corridor that migrates at a certain time. So I was actually thinking, and this is just conversation for people who are more in conversation with people in ags and markets and USDA, so Cornell for sure, we could have gotten earlier notice here. I mean, it's okay that we had this one incident, but I feel like if more education came sooner, because we were in that corridor, so they actually said in the article we could predict it would get to New York. So now in tandem, let's be proactive, look at the places actually we know the next migrations occur, and get to those folks and tell them to protect their birds. So that's a great question. It's now 9:13, so we've gone 13 minutes over. This has been so, I can't thank you all enough. I've learned a lot. I did write one little statement for Institute on why we did this little form, and if you would indulge me, I'm going to read it before we go. If anybody has to leave, by all means go. But for Institute for Animal Happiness, we wrote, people are starting to make critical connections. That human health, non-human health, and environmental health are inextricably linked. We have been simply maintaining a system that is producing more harm than is reasonable or even possible to justify. Getting this fact across in the greatest era of disconnect and denial is difficult. We at IFAH are honored to join with all vegan organizations, rescues, and sanctuaries towards becoming a strong, unified voice. We can no longer afford the terrible toll and costs of animal agriculture, as evidenced in the discussions tonight from all walks of knowledge and expertise. The harm caused by clinging to the outdated notion that it is safe, healthy, or sustainable to farm animals and feed humanity this way is a myth, and the scale at which we are causing harm on numerous platforms is impossible to quantify and justify. We've heard from experts tonight about the surreal lengths we're expected and must go to keep chickens and other avians healthy. We have learned that they can no longer be outside and that this is a scenario that will repeat and worsen. Tonight, we have discussed the science and how long the science community has continually cried out, this will only get worse. We've heard from rescues and sanctuaries about the toll on both the humans and the non-humans within those organizations, the exhausting protocols that must be put into place just to maintain safety for non-humans and humans alike, because these viruses jump. At what point do we all as a society recognize we have to change? How bad do things have to get? How many millions and even billions of lives lost will it take to change a habit, to acknowledge what we are doing doesn't work? There's only one path towards mitigating this growing crisis, and we we reaffirm that strongly at the end of this forum. The world must shift towards a fully vegan economy. This is a critical and undeniable step towards reducing the threat of zoonotic pandemics, ending cruelty towards animals, and the ones that we all claim to care about, and to stop burning the earth under our feet. May all the animal sanctuaries, rescues, and vegan organizations continue to raise their voices in unison more and more strongly. The world must listen. We cannot bear this sadness. We cannot stem the tide of zoonotic disease, and we're not here to make other people's destruction just look cute and adorable in a social media post. All in attendance must take this message back to your groups and your constituents, and please amplify it. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we'll stay connected via all those channels. Good night, everyone. And thank you all participants. Thank you very, very, very much.